The Veth called it mercy, what they did to the networks. Humans called it the end of the world, and then, after a while, they stopped calling it anything at all. Dara Solis found the terminal on a Tuesday, or what she'd been marking as a Tuesday. She'd been carving notches into the underside of her bunk since the Veth sealed the city's sky grid, and by her count, it had been 109 days since she'd spoken to another person out loud. The terminal sat in the maintenance sublevel of what had once been the Meridian Tower data center, half buried under a collapsed server rack, screen still cycling a dim amber standby pulse. It looked like breathing. She stood there a long time before she reached for it. The Veth had not destroyed human technology. That was the thing no one from the before times ever got right when they imagined the invasion. The films, the stories, the half-drunk conversations at bars that no longer existed, the aliens always came with fire. They came burning things. The Veth came with something quieter and more total. They came with administration. Within 6 months of first contact, every major communications array on Earth had been rerouted through the Quorum Net. The Veth's layered lattice of signal management that stretched from low orbit to the ocean floors. You could still make a call. You could still send a message. But the Quorum Net filtered everything, for intent, for collusion, what the Veth classified as organizational threat, which it turned out included most forms of human intimacy. Two people making plans. A mother telling her son she was frightened. A man in a bunker typing to a stranger at 3 in the morning because the silence had grown a mouth and started breathing back. All of it, flagged, delayed, rerouted into the void. The Veth were not cruel. Dara had spent 109 days deciding this. They were something worse. They were incurious. Humans were infrastructure to them, the same way plumbing was infrastructure. Something to be maintained at minimum cost, managed against failure, never understood. The Quorum Net didn't suppress human connection because the Veth feared it. It suppressed human connection because connection looked to Veth pattern recognition systems like the early signal architecture of rebellion. And rebellion was bad for administration. She powered the terminal on. It took 4 minutes to boot, the old-style spinning wheel crawling across the display like it had all the time in the universe. She didn't rush it. She'd learned not to rush things in the last 109 days. Rushing was what you did when you believed time was finite and personal, when you believed someone was waiting on the other end. She sat on an overturned server chassis and listened to the building breathe through its ventilation ducts, and waited for the machine to decide it was ready. The interface that came up was nothing she recognized, not Veth. She knew Veth. Their interfaces were clean to the point of abstraction, right-angled geometries and color gradients that moved like slow water. This was jagged. This was human-built in that specific way that human-built things were. Functional edges showing, digital equivalent of tape holding something together, a command prompt, a blinking cursor. Beneath it, a string of text that had clearly been sitting there for a long time, its timestamp corrupted beyond reading. The text said, "If anyone is out there, please respond. I have been trying for a while." Dara sat very still. Then she put her hands on the keyboard. Her name was Dara Solis. For the Veth, she had been a network infrastructure engineer for a municipal services firm, which meant she spent her days maintaining the digital plumbing that kept a city's water bills, traffic lights, parking meters humming in approximate coordination. It was not glamorous work. It suited her. She liked systems. She liked the way a system could be read. Every anomaly a message. Every error a sentence in a language that rewarded patience. She had never been the kind of person who thrived in rooms full of people. She had always been more comfortable with the architecture behind the room than with the room itself. The invasion had, in one very specific way, been almost comprehensible to her. She understood what the Veth had done because she understood networks. She'd spent her first weeks of occupation not panicking but mapping. Sketching the shape of the Quorum Net's reach in a notebook, marking the dead zones, the relay gaps, the places where the signal management had seams. Because all systems had seams. That was the first thing you learned. Whoever built it, however smart they were, systems had seams. She found 6 of them in the city before she found the terminal. She typed back, "I am here, who are you?" The cursor blinked. Once, twice, 9 times. Then, "My name is Wen." I'm in the basement of what used to be the central library. I built this relay 6 months ago. You're the first person who's ever answered." She looked at that for a long moment. 6 months, she typed. "You've been trying for 6 months?" "Yes." Pressed her palms flat against the cold metal of the chassis. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she'd been doing every morning to keep the panic manageable. And she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't known was sealed. "I have been trying for 109 days, she typed. 109 days of silence so complete she'd started cataloging sounds just to maintain sanity. The specific pitch of the ventilation ducts at different times of day, the distant cycling of the VETH atmospheric processors that gave the sealed city its faintly chemical air, the sound of her own voice reading engineering manuals aloud. Because otherwise she'd forget what her voice sounded like. 109 days of being the only person in a city of what had once been 2 million who was running on her own frequency. The library has a good archive," Wen typed. "I've been reading a lot. What have you been reading? Everything. Right now I'm on Victorian naturalists. Did you know there was a man named Henry Walter Bates who spent 11 years in the Amazon and came back with 8,000 species that science had never cataloged? He just stayed and kept looking." Dara looked at that. "I think about staying a lot," she typed. "I think about what it means to keep looking." A pause, then, "Yeah, me too. That was how it started. They were careful." Dara was careful. It was the same muscle she used when navigating the quorum net seams, the same instinct that said move slowly, stay dark, see that you don't intend to give. The terminal's relay ran through a dead zone gap she'd marked in her notebook as point 7, a corridor of signal shadow beneath the old transit hub, where the VETH's lattice had a structural blind spot, a ghost of the original human network's routing architecture, that the quorum net's designers had apparently not bothered to excise. It was sloppy by human engineering standards. She'd thought about that a lot. The VETH were so far ahead of humans technologically that their sloppiness was still years beyond human best effort, and yet sloppiness was sloppiness. A gap was a gap. She had 2 hours each night before the relay's power cell needed to rest. She used every minute. Wen Chao had been a graduate student in computational linguistics before the VETH came. He was 26. He had a younger sister he hadn't heard from in 4 months, who'd last been in a resettlement block on the other side of the city. He drank too much instant coffee because the library's emergency supplies were heavy on it and light on everything else. He'd been keeping his own notebook. Not of seams in the quorum net, but of words. Languages he was teaching himself from the library's archive. Welsh, Swahili, a Polynesian dialect he'd found in a bound academic journal from 1987. "Why languages?" Dara had asked on the 4th night. "Because if they take everything else," she typed back, paused, "then I mean, if everything else goes. He is still thinking a language no one else knows. It's the smallest possible private space." She'd sat with that for a long time. She'd started teaching herself Welsh the next day. "Borda," she typed at him the following evening. "Good morning, Borda," he typed back immediately, and she'd laughed. The first time she'd laughed in 113 days. Loud enough that she'd had to slap her hand over her mouth, heart hammering, listening for VETH patrol drones. None came, the laugh stayed hers. And was funny in the specific way of someone who'd been scared for a very long time and had decided that humor was cheaper than despair. He sent her passages from Victorian naturalists with deadpan commentary. He sent her linguistic puzzles. He sent her once a 9-paragraph description of the sound a library makes at 3 in the morning that was so precise and strange and beautiful that she'd read it 4 times. And then stared at the ceiling of the sublevel for an hour, thinking about the distance between them, and whether distance was a fixed thing or something that could be worked. She was thinking about this, the malleability of distance, when she found the second anomaly. It was on the 43rd day of talking to Wen. She was running her nightly check of the relay's signal path when she noticed the echo, fractional lag in the transmission, a microsecond delay that hadn't been there the night before. She ran the diagnostic twice, 3 times. The relay's hardware hadn't changed. The power cell was stable. The delay was external. Something new in the signal environment between point 7 and the library basement. She knew what it was before she'd finished the analysis. The Quorum Net was learning. She'd read enough about Veth administration to know that their systems weren't static. The Quorum Net was adaptive. It didn't just monitor, it improved, routing around anomalies, tightening its mesh over time. She'd always known this. She'd built her 2-hour window on the understanding that it would eventually shrink. She'd assumed she had months. Microsecond delay said she had weeks, maybe less, she told Wen. His response took longer than usual. When it came, it was short. How long? She typed her honest estimate, 3 weeks. Possibly 4, another long pause. Then, okay, I've been working on something. I didn't want to tell you yet because it wasn't finished. But I found a way to bridge to the Eastern Transit Node. If I can get physical access to the relay junction there. It's about 2 kilometers from the library. I can reroute the signal through a deeper, dead zone. It would buy us more time. Dara stared at that. It's 2 kilometers, she typed. Through open street grid. Trolls. I know what the patrols are. She pressed her hands together. Shh. She thought about the shape of the Veth patrol routes. She'd mapped from the sub-level's single narrow window, the dim geometric regularity of their sweeps, the way they moved like water-finding level. Efficient, impersonal, utterly certain of their own territory. You've never gone out, she typed. Since the occupation started. A very long pause. I leave the library to get water from the cistern 2 blocks north at night, I know. The gaps, that's not the same thing. No, it's not. She sat there in the amber pulse of the standby light for a long time. She thought about Henry Walter Bates in the Amazon, 11 years, 8,000 species. She thought about a man who stayed because something was worth cataloging. She thought about Bordeaux and 3 a.m., libraries and Welsh as the smallest possible private space, and a crack in her chest that had been sealed for 109 days. I'll do it, she typed. I'll go to the transit node. You walk me through the relay junction specs, and I'll do the physical access. You don't know where it is. You just said 2 kilometers from the library. I have maps. You'd have to cross 3 patrol corridors. I know what the patrols are. She typed back at him, his own words. A pause, then slowly, Dara, she waited. Why are you doing this? She looked at the cursor. She thought about what to say. She thought about all the things she could say. Engineering logic, network preservation, tactical value of maintaining a communication channel. All the things that were true, but not the whole truth. Not the real engine of it, she typed. Because it took you 6 months to find me, and it took me 109 days to be found, and I don't want to go back to that. I won't go back to that. The cursor blinked. Then, okay, then be careful then. I'll have the junction specs ready by tomorrow night. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling of the sublevel, which was stained with old water damage, in a pattern that she'd spent weeks interpreting as clouds, as maps as the surface of some other planet. She breathed in and out. She felt very clearly that she was afraid, and she felt equally clearly that the fear was not going to stop her, which was a new feeling or an old feeling she'd forgotten she had. She started planning. The Veth Patrol architecture in this sector used a 17-minute sweep cycle with a 2-corridor simultaneous coverage pattern. She'd mapped it from her window over 3 weeks, noting the specific gate signature of the assessor drones. The Veth's mobile monitoring units flee the size and shape of a large dog, moving on 4 articulated limbs that were not quite legs, with a sensor cluster at the forward end that pulsed dull violet when active. They were not armed. The Veth didn't need their administrative units to be armed, because the concept of a human successfully evading one long enough to matter was apparently not a scenario they'd modeled. Dara spent 2 days on that gap, the unmodeled scenario. What did it mean to be beyond the edge of someone else's imagination? It meant you were free to move. She went out on a Wednesday, a real Wednesday. She was fairly sure, though her notch count had grown harder to trust. She left the sub-level at 2:14 a.m., crossing the first patrol corridor in the dead window between the 17-minute sweep cycles, 6th and 7th passes. She wore dark clothes and moved low and kept to the structural shadow of the building's bases, where the Veth's atmospheric processors vented a thin ground-level mist that played havoc with lower-spectrum sensors. She'd read that in a captured Veth maintenance document she'd found on an abandoned official tablet. The processor's mist was a nuisance variable, their own sensor data. She wore it like armor, The city at 2 a.m. was a different city, without the human nightlife that had once roughed up its corners. The bars, the late traffic, the people walking dogs and arguing and laughing too loud. It had a clarity to it that she found, against all expectation, beautiful. The Veth's atmospheric processors kept the air clean. The sealed sky grid reflected the city's own ambient light back down, so the streets glowed a permanent dim amber, like the inside of the terminal's standby screen. She moved through it feeling like the only person in the world, which she supposed, in any practical sense, she was. She crossed the second corridor on her belly, through a construction drainage trench she'd marked on the map. She crossed the third corridor by going through a collapsed shopfront, picking through the dark by touch and the map in her head, counting doorways. The transit node junction box was exactly where the specs said it would be. It was mounted on the external wall of the old transit hub's service entrance. Behind a panel she had to lever open with a piece of rebar she'd picked up in the drainage trench. Her hands were shaking. She made herself breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and the shaking slowed enough to work. The relay crossover took 22 minutes. She'd practiced the sequence on a scavenged board in the sub-level until she could do it in the dark. She did it in the dark. Her fingers found the terminals by feel, by sequence, by the muscle memory of a person who had spent 111 days learning to live in a world that wanted her to disappear. She made the final connection. Above her, somewhere in the amber dark, an assessor drone swept the third corridor for the 14th time and registered nothing. She went back the way she came. It took 40 minutes instead of 23 because she made herself go slower, because she knew the specific trap of finishing a dangerous thing and then getting sloppy in the relief of it. She returned to the sub-level at 3:07 a.m., sat down on the server chassis, and spent 5 minutes shaking without trying to stop it. Then she powered the terminal on. It worked. When typed, I can see the signal. It's routing. It's a pause. It bought us at least another month, maybe 6 weeks. She sat in the amber pulse. "Da," she typed, even though it was nearly 4 in the morning. The response was immediate. "Bor da." They talked about what to do with 6 weeks. It was not the same conversation as what to do with 3. 6 weeks felt like something you could build in. It felt like, not safety. Nothing felt like safety anymore. But proximity to safety. The outline of a shape that safety might eventually fill. Wen had been working on something else too. He told her about it carefully. The way you present a plan to someone who will find the holes in it. He'd found, in the library's physical archive, a pre-occupation telecommunications study that had mapped 17 additional dead zone corridors beneath the city's infrastructure layer. Sub-basement channels, old pneumatic mail tunnels, decommissioned fiber conduit runs. The study was from 2031, 6 years before the Veth came, and it had been compiled by a municipal infrastructure firm, Dara's firm. She'd done 2 of those surveys herself. She put her face in her hands and laughed for a long time. When you stopped laughing, Wen typed, "Do you want to look at them?" She stopped laughing. She looked at them. What they were looking at, she realized slowly, was not just a list of dead zones. It was a map. A map of a network that the Veth had in their thoroughness missed, because they'd built the quorum net over the city's active infrastructure, and was the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure. The ghost network of pipes and channels and forgotten conduit that no one had needed for 30 years, and therefore no one had bothered to flag in any registry that the Veth would have consulted. The map connected 26 points across the city. 26 points. Point 7 was one of them. She looked at the map for a long time. She thought about networks. She thought about the nature of a system with seams. She thought about a man named Henry Walter Bates, who'd stayed in a forest for 11 years. He believed in the importance of what was still uncatalogued. She thought about 2 million people who had stopped trying to talk to each other. "This isn't just for us," she typed. "I know," Wen typed back. "I've been thinking about that. If we could reach the other nodes, we'd need people at each one. People who know how to run a relay. The city isn't empty." "I know. The city isn't empty." She took a breath. She thought about what she was about to say. She'd been a person who preferred the architecture to the room, who was more comfortable with systems than with people, spent 111 days learning to be alone. because there'd been no other option. He thought about how the Veth had built an administration based on the premise that human connection was a threat vector. She thought about how they weren't wrong. We have to find them, she typed. The other people. We have to reach the other 25 points. Yes. That's going to take a long time. Yes, and it's dangerous. She looked at the cursor. Were you a person who did dangerous things before? No. You? No. She paused. I think that might be why we're still here. The people who did dangerous things went first. We waited. We mapped. We read. Now we know things that dangerous people didn't know yet. That's a very generous interpretation of our cowardice. She smiled. Face felt strange doing it, like a hinge that hadn't been used in a while. It's the correct interpretation, she typed. There's a difference. A long pause. She waited, comfortable in it, the way she'd learned to be comfortable in the spaces between transmissions, reading them as language rather than absence. Then, okay, when typed then, I found a record in the library archive, route between here and the transit hub, underground through the old pneumatic network. I think I can make it in about 2 hours if I move carefully. She looked at that. You want to come here. I want to come there. She put her hand on the keyboard. She thought about the crack in her chest that had been sealed and then opened. She thought about Bordeaux at 4 in the morning. She thought about what it had cost both of them to get here. Not the physical cost, the other cost. The one you couldn't put in a notebook. The one that was made of days and silence, and the specific weight of being a person in a world that had decided to stop noticing you. The relay will hold, she typed. The route through the old pneumatic, I know it. I surveyed part of it in 2033. There's a junction point under the transit hub basement that exits into the sublevel corridor about 40 meters from my position. How do you know which sublevel? I'm in Meridian Tower Data Center. Sublevel 3, a pause. Oh, he typed. Oh? Mapped that building as a possible secondary relay point 3 months ago. It's on my list. She stared at the screen. You've had Meridian on your list for 3 months. Yes, and you didn't. You were going to come here eventually anyway. I was going to come eventually. I was trying to find someone there first, so I wasn't walking into an empty building. She sat back on the server chassis. She looked at the amber pulse of the standby light. She felt something she couldn't entirely name. Something in the territory between frustration and awe and fondness, which was, she was realizing, a territory humans spent a lot of time in with each other. The territory of recognizing that another person has been doing their own version of the same thing you've been doing, separately, in parallel, without coordinating, because that was just what people did. Okay, she typed. Come now. Guide you through the junction points.
I have the survey notes now?
It's nearly 5 a.m. The patrol cycle resets at 6. You have a window. It's the middle of the night. You've been awake this whole time anyway. So have I. Another pause, then slowly, yes, okay. She pulled out her notebook. The one with the maps, the seams, the 43 days of signal analysis. And she started reading him the route. 2 hours and 11 minutes. She stayed on the terminal the entire time. Walking him through junctions she'd mapped, and some she was reconstructing from memory and survey notes, talking him through a moment when he lost the path, in a collapsed section of the pneumatic tunnel, and had to double back 40 meters. She stayed steady, once, quietly. I don't think I can, she said you can, and told him the next landmark to look for, and he found it. At 7:03 a.m. she heard footsteps. Real footsteps. Not the memory of footsteps. Not the ghost sound her brain had started generating in months 5 and 6 of isolation. The auditory hallucinations of presence that she'd had to learn to catalog as artifacts. Real footsteps, a real cadence, uneven with exhaustion and nerves, moving through the sublevel corridor. She was standing at the terminal. Her hands were on the keyboard, but she wasn't typing anything. She was listening to the footsteps get closer, and she was trying to breathe in through her nose and out through her mouth, and finding that it wasn't working the way it usually did, because the thing she was breathing through was different from the thing she'd been breathing through for months. It was not the managed panic of silence. It was something else entirely, something she'd stopped believing she'd feel again. The door opened. He was younger than she'd imagined. Not in a surprising way. She'd known he was 26. But in the way of someone who had been going through something that makes a person look their age instead of making them look older. A particular kind of youth that survives by going inward. He was carrying a battered satchel and wearing 3 layers of dark clothing, and he had dust from the pneumatic tunnels on his face, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who has found something they've been looking for so long they'd forgotten what finding it felt like. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Dara," he said. His voice was strange, raw in the way of a voice that hadn't been used for speaking in a while. Like a hinge. "When?" she said. Her own voice sounded like that too. They stood there for a moment in the amber light of the sublevel, the terminal pulsing behind her. Her notebook on the server chassis with its months of maps and notches and seams, his satchel full of. She would learn later. 3 linguistic dictionaries, the Victorian naturalist volumes, and a folded copy of the Pneumatic Network Survey from the library archive. He held out his hand, a formal gesture, oddly formal for the circumstances, and she shook it. And then, neither of them let go for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasted. She was aware of the specific weight of another person's hand in hers, the temperature of it, the realness of it, the unmistakable fact of it. 6 more nodes, she said. "I know. The map covers the whole city. I know. If we're going to reach all of them, we need." She stopped. Started again. "We need more time, and we need more people, and we need to be very careful about the order we do things." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She finally let go of his hand. She turned back to the terminal. "Sit down. I'll show you what I've mapped, and you show me the linguistic archive. If we're going to communicate with people we find at the other nodes, we should probably code," he said immediately. "We need a code, not encryption, something the quorum net doesn't recognize as language. I've been thinking about this." He was already opening the satchel. "There's a linguist, 1950s, named Vogelin, who documented a partially reconstructed language from the Great Basin region." She smiled. Her face did it easier this time. The sealed skygrid somewhere in the upper atmosphere. The Veth QuorumNet continued its patient administration of a city it believed it understood. It logged the ambient signals of its managed infrastructure. It ran its pattern recognition systems across the vast quiet of 2 million humans, moving through their reduced lives. It noted, as it had always noted, no organized anomaly, no collusion signature, no threat architecture. Below it, in a sublevel that smelled of old server hardware and dust and tunnel air, 2 people sat at a terminal and began building a language the QuorumNet had never heard. It would take them 4 months to reach the 2nd node, 8 months to reach the 5th. 14 months to build what they eventually started calling, in the private Welsh they'd been teaching each other, the Weedwaith, the network. It grew the way all real networks grow, not in a straight line, not according to plan, but along the seams, along the gaps, along the places where the thing meant to contain it had been built by people who were very smart, but not quite smart enough to imagine what lay beneath the infrastructure they were managing. The Veth's first indication that something was wrong came not from the QuorumNet, which had never detected the Ruidwaith at all, but from an entirely different system, their behavioral modeling array, which had been tracking aggregate human metrics across the occupied city, for signs of the organizational threat patterns they were programmed to watch for. The array registered, after 14 months, a statistically significant increase in what it classified as purposeful movement. Not organized movement in the military sense. Just people, more people than the model predicted. Going places with intention, meeting each other, building things. The array flagged this to an assessor station for review. The review process, given the Veth's administrative structure, was not fast. It went through 4 levels of routing. It took 6 weeks. By the time the first Veth administrative team arrived to investigate the behavioral anomaly, the Ruidwaith had 23 nodes. By the time they had figured out what they were looking at, it had all 26. It was not a rebellion, not yet. There were no weapons in it, no military architecture. It was something the Veth's classification systems had no category for, an infrastructure of presence. A city that had relearned how to talk to itself. 2 million people who had been isolated and administered and managed into silence had, along the seams of the system that managed them, found their way back to each other. Not with defiance, not with violence, with language and maps, and the specific stubbornness of a species that has always been very bad at accepting the premise that they should stop. Dara Solis was at Node 7 when the Veth team arrived at Node 1. She was teaching a woman named Petra, who had been a school teacher, how to run the relay equipment. Petra was fast, faster than Dara had been. She had the quality that good teachers have, that specific attentiveness to the structure of a thing, the same instinct Dara had for systems. When called her on the Woodworth's internal channel, their end-to-end, the deep dead zone routing that the Quorum net had still not found. His voice through the relay sounded like his voice through the terminal itself. "They've found Node 1, he said. How long until they get to the others? At their current investigation pace, weeks. Will the pace increase once they understand what they're looking at?" She thought about this. They'll find the relay architecture. The architecture isn't the point anymore. No, the point is the people. And the people know each other now. A pause. Through the relay she could hear, faintly, the sound of the library, its particular silence, which she now knew well enough to read like weather. "I've been thinking," Wen said, "about Bates. In the Amazon. He didn't stay because he was trying to defeat the Amazon. He stayed because he was cataloging it, recording it, making something of it that could be known. Yes, we don't have to fight them, Dara. We're not equipped for that. But we've built something that can be known, something that knows itself. And that's," he paused, "that's different from what they were managing," she finished. Yes, she looked at Petra, who was writing relay coordinates in a notebook that looked exactly like Dara's notebook. The same cheap spiral bound, from the same office supply cache, the same instinct to record, to map, to build a record of what could be known. Quorum net, Dara said slowly, was designed to manage a population that didn't know it was a population. Yes, 26 nodes and 2 months of operation, and now 2 million people know they're a population. More or less. That's not something you can unknow. Through the relay she heard Wen breathe. A real breath, a human breath. Specific sound of someone sitting with something. "No," he said, "it's not." The Veth decommissioned 3 nodes in the following 4 weeks. They moved efficiently once they understood the architecture, which was the nature of the Veth. Slow to notice, fast to respond. They pulled the relay equipment, disrupted the signal routing, locked down the physical locations. By then, the people at those nodes had already passed what they knew to the people adjacent to them. The knowledge of the Ridewaith, how to build a relay, how to find a dead zone, how to speak in a language the Quorum net couldn't categorize, was no longer held in nodes. It was held in people. The Veth administration submitted a formal assessment to the Quorum oversight body 17 months after Dara had first answered Wen's message. The assessment noted, with what passed in Veth bureaucratic language for concern, that the occupied human population had undergone an unexpected cohesion event. The isolation protocol had not performed as modeled. The human population's organizational capacity had increased, rather than decreased under sustained signal management. The assessment recommended a review of the isolation model's foundational assumptions. Specifically, the assumption that isolation produces passivity in the managed population. Specifically, the related assumption that a population's connection impulse, when suppressed, will attenuate. The assessment noted that neither of these assumptions had held. It recommended further study. The Quorum oversight body logged the assessment and routed it for review. The review process would take, at current administrative velocity, approximately 3 months. In those 3 months, Dara Solis rebuilt Node 4 from a different physical location, using components sourced from 4 different decommissioned sites, running a signal path through a dead zone corridor that was not on any document the Veth had ever accessed because it had been surveyed by a single municipal infrastructure engineer in 2033, and never formally logged, because the firm she worked for had gone through a records management transition that quarter and several reports had been misfiled. In those 3 months, Wen Chao completed the linguistic codebook in a form that could be distributed physically, printed, copied, carried in a coat pocket. It was 42 pages. It used 3 partially reconstructed and 2 entirely invented languages as its base, layered in ways that made the code non-decodable without the codebook, and also, critically, non-recognizable as code to a pattern recognition system that was looking for organizational threat signals because it had been specifically designed to look to Veth sensors, like natural human language variation. In those 3 months, 22 people Dara had met through the Ruidwaith learned to run relay equipment. In those 3 months, Petra the school teacher taught 11 of them. The Veth's next assessment, submitted to the oversight body 4 months after the first, noted continued cohesion event. It noted increased population agency metrics. It noted something that the assessment writer, a Veth administrative functionary who had never particularly concerned itself with the philosophy of management, expressed with what was, for Veth formal documentation, unusual directness. True. The managed population appears to have developed resistance to isolation through mechanisms not anticipated by the isolation protocol. The resistance does not take the form of organized defiance but of distributed resilience. Each suppression of a network node results in the redistribution of that node's function across adjacent elements of the population. The network does not have a center to remove. The assessment recommended suspension of current isolation protocols pending fundamental model revision. Quorum oversight body did not approve the suspension. It approved continued monitoring and a graduated response. This was, in retrospect, the wrong call. But the quorum oversight body was a Veth administrative structure, and Veth administrative structures were very good at managing things that fit their models, and very bad at managing things that had decided to be something else. 3 years and 4 months after the Veth had sealed the city's sky grid, 2 years and 11 months after Dara Solis had answered a message that had been sitting unanswered for 6 months, the first formal contact between the human population and the Veth administrative authority was initiated, not by the Veth, by a delegation of 7 humans who arrived at the administrative center via a route that should not have existed, using a communications protocol the Quorum Net had not known to monitor, speaking in a formal register that no Veth administrator had heard a human use in over 3 years. Dara was not in the delegation. She was at Node 7, running the relay that was carrying the delegation's communications back to the other 23 functioning nodes, so that what happened in that room was witnessed in real time by a significant fraction of the 2 million people the administration had been managing. She was listening when the lead delegate, a former city council member named Osakwi, who had spent 3 years in the Ridwaith and had particular confidence of someone who has had a long time to think about what they would say when this moment came, told the senior Veth administrator that the isolation protocol had been a misunderstanding of what isolation does to humans. She was listening when the administrator asked what isolation did to humans. She was listening when Osakwi said, quite calmly, "It taught us to value connection more than we did before, and we were already a species that valued it very much." Through the relay, over the Ridwaith, across 23 nodes, and however many thousands of people were listening in kitchens and sublevels and library basements, she heard the administrator's response. It was a long pause. The Veth were not a species given to long pauses in formal contexts. Then the administrator said something that the real-time translator rendered, imperfectly, as, "This was not the intended outcome." And Osakwi said, "No, I imagine it wasn't." And Dara, alone at Node 7, allowed herself a small smile. Her face did it easily now. The hinge was well used. She thought about when, in the library, surrounded by dictionaries. She thought about Borda. She thought about a man in the Amazon who stayed because something was worth cataloging. She thought about the weight of another person's hand and the specific sound of a real voice in a room. She thought about systems and seams and the thing you find when you go looking in the spaces where the map runs out. Then she turned back to the relay and kept the signal open.